And there it is. Welcome, everybody, to episode 279. Tonight's wonderful topic of discussion will be near death experiences. As always, I am your illustrious host, Robert Solomon. And with me over on this end of the platform, as you can see, is the one, the only, the Spidertron 5000. And below us is Steven the intern. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So you're probably asking yourself, you're probably thinking to yourself, why on earth are them Uncanny boys doing the dang show on a Thursday? Well, let me tell you a little story. It's not really a story. It's not really anything, honestly. Because I will not be here. So that is why. There you go. There it is.
I need to load up our applause and things so we can play
Yeah,
that.
we'll get to that.
We got that section for like music and sound. I should just load it all up soon. And just
I'm not
like,
paying you to do nothing.
I ain't getting paid for nothing, so.
Hey, yeah, that's right. And you enjoy it. Near-death experiences, gentlemen. Between the two of you, which one of you have had one?
I have.
I have had close, but not really. I wouldn't call it an NDE per se, but that was more just childhood trauma stuff.
I won't say that I actually had the classic, like the whole out of body and the whole everything, but I have been in 3 car accidents that all should have ended in a fatality.
Okay.
I have been so close to a lightning strike that the tree was like 3 feet over my head and it hit the tree instead of me because I was under the tree. I overdosed, which is not something to be proud of. I'm not listing all these things like I'm so happy about all of it. It's just a bunch of things that happened. And there's a couple other things, like I was hit by a car as an adult. That was fun.
I'm sorry. It makes sense because it's you. Like anybody else, I'd feel bad for, but I'm like, yeah, that makes sense.
The universe has been trying to take me out for a long time, and it has failed so far.
It's because he's under my protection.
Hey there, James.
They always
Boggs,
try to
welcome.
kill me, but miss. And so, yeah, I've got a list of things that have gone on, but I'll leave it at that. It's been a interesting life, as the Chinese would say.
Did they say that? Because I've never once heard a Chinese person go, "It's been an interesting life."
When they want to curse you, a Chinese curse is "May you live an interesting life." It doesn't mean "May you live like, oh, that's interesting." It's like interesting in ways that are just like rather than like.
What was that? What was that again?
Yeah. Okay.
Like shaking like that because that's interesting for somebody.
I don't like it, but fine, we'll allow it. Anyways, so let's go over a couple things. We're going to go over first of all some interesting points here, and then we're going to let Steven kind of talk about some cases, and then we're going to eat bottles of queso. Just kidding, it all came together perfectly, so I had to say something. I like queso so very much.
Okay, so
queso and guacamole, man, that's it.
Guacamole.
Guacamole is the jam.
Don't get me started. We'll take over the show, and it's not about guacamole, but I would like.
Well, when you bring back your show, your Monday night show, whatever that is, you better have and I better be invited to the guacamole throwdown.
Guacamole Fest 2024.
That's a great game. I've got both of them. Anyways, so an NDE or near-death experience is a personal experience that is in fact associated with death or impending death. And when a positive NDE occurs, everything seems to be blissful, peaceful. The following things happen, but they're not limited to detachment from your body, the OBE or the out-of-body experience, the sense of floating above your body and being able to see the surroundings, such as if the ambulance or the EMTs are trying to bring you back to life, or a doctor trying to bring you back to life by let's try this again. How do I say this?
Pulmonary? No.
Is it? No, it's resuscitation. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation.
Cardio, yeah.
There you go.
That's probably
that sounds good.
That sounds good. Some medical professionals going to jump in the comments. Good. That's not right at all. You guys suck.
Get your facts straight.
I was going to subscribe to the Patreon for $600 a month.
I'm going to call Snopes.
I'm going to call Snoop Dogg. See, I did that.
Mhm.
Anyways,
Stare
so
at
like
it.
some of the things that happen, like I said, and then feelings of levitation, total serenity, peace, warmth, joy, and a review of one's life. So, the whole I um, feel like my life flashed before my eyes type of situation occurs in these NDEs. But a negative NDE is associated with anguish, distress, a void, and hellish imagery. So a lot of your folks that say, I was in hell for, so many minutes, a lot of religious folks will attune to that. Now, the prime occurrences of NDEs usually occur during what is known as reversible clinical death, meaning that the person may flatline for so many minutes, but the person can be resuscitated and brought back to life. Obviously, if you get decapitated, you're probably not going to have an NDE. Or if you just die on the spot, you probably will not have an NDE. But the explanations about what an NDE actually is run the gamut from scientific to religious. Neuroscientists hypothesize that NDEs are caused by disturbed body multisensory integration that only occurs during life threatening events. And they're reported by about 17% of those who nearly die. Now, these are folks, obviously, that are in that area to take it in. So, like, if it's somebody, that has an NDE in another country, that's a little bit harder to record because some countries don't share medical records with the World Health Organization. So we have to kind of understand that. Now, in 1892, a series of subjective observations by workers falling from scaffolds, injuries suffered by soldiers during war, climbers who had fallen, and near drownings were reported by Albert Heim. One, Victor Egger, proposed the term experience de mort imminente, meaning the experiencing death imminent, or the imminent experiencing of death. And this came about because the research regarding climber stories of the panoramic life review during our falls. Now, in 1968, Celia Green published some 400 first-hand accounts of out-of-body experiences. Now, let's go over some traits of NDE. A sense or awareness of being dead. So you're like, oh man, this is it. This is a wrap. And a message I got from a couple people told me that they knew they were dead. I gotten I put out a little feeler today on people who have had them, and I said, hey, you want to talk about it, and we did. I will keep those people private because they didn't even ask me, but I didn't ask them, and I'm not going to put their business out there because I didn't ask them. So we're going to leave that anonymous. But the people that I had talked to said they knew they were dead. They knew that they were not in their body. They knew that they were moving on into another realm. They felt a sense of peace and positive emotions, but also a sense of unconditional love and acceptance and a very euphoric environment feeling. Of course, they had the out of body experiences and a perception of one's body from an outside position. Now, that's the part that kind of fascinates me, is the concept of being able to see one's body once you're outside of it. Once you're like floating outside of your body, looking down, be like, man, I really need to lose weight, you know? Or man, I couldn't have went out with a better hairstyle today. That sort of thing. Cause that's what I would say if I was having and like, man, somebody did my hair terribly. Who okayed that? Who left the house like that? But seeing that, and sometimes they could even see the medical professionals' resuscitation efforts. Now, a tunnel experience, a lot of people have talked about a tunnel experience, or entering a darkness, moving up a passageway or staircase, a rapid movement toward or sudden immersion in a powerful light. A lot of the times, the go to the light phrase is used, and sometimes they will see beings of light or beings who are dressed in all white. They have a reunification with deceased loved ones. They have their life review, and they approach a border or decision by oneself or others to return to one's body, often accompanied by a reluctance to return. They're peaceful, they don't want to go, or sometimes they want to go or they regret dying. One of the gentlemen, one of the people I had talked to, said that he wanted to be there with his wife. He was sad that he would not be able to be with her and his children. And so he went back, and now, he's still here with us. And suddenly finding oneself back inside their body, The young lady I talked to said that she felt a slamming on her chest, and that was the paramedics bringing her back to life. And she recognized that she was at that point, present in time, in her body. Now, psychiatrist Raymond Moody claimed to have witnessed an NDE and gave these steps to what he witnessed. He said there was a sudden peace and relief from pain. There was a perception of a relaxing sound or otherworldly music. Consciousness or spirit ascending above the person's body, sometimes remotely viewing sometimes remotely viewing medical professionals' attempts at resuscitation, autoscopy, the person's spirit leaving the earthly realm and ascending rapidly through a tunnel of light in a universe of darkness, arriving at a brilliant or heavenly place, being met by people of light who are usually deceased friends and family in a joyous reunion, meeting with a deity that is often perceived as their religious culture would have perceived it, or as an intense mass emanating pure love and light. In the presence of the deity, the person undergoes an instantaneous life review and understands how all the good and bad they have done has affected them and others. And this is the part that really sort of pulls it all together here. The person returns to their earthly body and life because either they are told it's not their time to die, or they are given a choice and they return to their family for their benefit and the loved ones. However, the one thing we need to take into account too is people that have these NDEs at this time come back with a sort of sense of spiritual a spiritual awakening. The young lady that I talked to said she gained mediumship powers at that point. So something to think about. Big shout out to King Nerd Zeus there. So what's up, buddy? I see you're dorking around today. Alfie, of course. Alfie, what's going on? And LS Barrios, what's going on? How's everybody doing today? Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hope everybody's enjoying the show. So now we're talking about near-death experiences. If you have one you'd like to talk about, please put it in the chat and we'll definitely discuss it. Now, I do want to take a minute to talk about Buddha monks here. Buddha monks, they did a 3-year longitudinal study. I probably butchered that word. Has revealed that some Buddhist meditation practitioners are able to willfully induce near-death experiences at a pre-planned point in time. Unlike traditional NDEs, these Buddhist monks themselves are able to consciously aware that they're experiencing the meditation-induced NDE and retain control over its content and duration. The Dalai Lama himself has also asserted that experienced meditators can deliberately induce the NDE state during meditation, being able to recognize and sustain it. Recognize it and sustain it. So being aware that they're actually in that NDE is probably one of the more interesting aspects of this topic that we're going to be discussing tonight. And we're going to discuss what I've talked about here, and then we're going to jump into some psychological models and some physiological models regarding NDEs and why they are what they are. So first off, gentlemen, I got to ask you guys, what are your thoughts on NDEs? We'll start with Steven the intern.
All right. So from what I've seen and what I've researched so far, one thing that really stood out to me was how both, like, no matter what religion you are, no matter what culture or spiritual affiliation you consider yourself to be, a lot of people had very similar experiences where they, like you mentioned, a lot of them would see lights. And I posted in the group earlier today about a man who claimed that he was an atheist, and then he had a near-death experience. And he said that these creatures tried to lead him away from his body after he separated his consciousness from his body. He said that there were these creatures that tried to lead him away. And then after he got a little bit further away, he started to realize something wasn't right. So he decided that he didn't want to go with these creatures anymore. And he told them he didn't want to go. But they didn't like that. So they started attacking him, biting him, clawing at him, and all this other stuff. And he didn't believe in God, but he heard a voice say, "Pray to God." And he was just like, "I don't believe in God." And then the voice sounded more forceful, and it was like, "Pray to God." And he was like, "Okay, geez, chill out." So he started praying to God, and he asked Jesus to come save him. And next thing he knew, a shining light came down from the sky and saved him. And long story short, he claims that it was Jesus, and he said that he hugged him and saved him from these creatures and took him up into like what he thought was the cosmic stuff, like stars and everything else. And then he had a conversation with Jesus, and now he came back and he claims they're best friends. And I'm like, that seems like a lot to believe, but like I said, a lot of these people have like very similar experiences.
Um, it's interesting because while we have a lot of spiritual attachment to near-death experiences, there is a lot of scientific potential evidence to show that these things happen within the mind, one way or the other. Whether it's actually you meeting a spiritual being or not is almost kind of beside the point. We know that when a person is declared to have died, the brain continues for at least a few minutes afterwards because the energy hasn't quite worked itself out. And that's the window when you can possibly resuscitate the person, or when the person could, you know, manage to still be alive.
Mhm.
And so because the brain controls so much of everything else, it's entirely possible, strictly from a scientific point of view, that the brain is like, hey, we're in some serious trouble. I need to convince you that you need to get back up because I'm not done yet. And it could concoct something that you would recognize, or that would convince you to be like, hey, wow, I'm not ready to die yet. And it
Yeah.
gives you the willpower you need to kind of jumpstart yourself, or at least be more open to jumpstarting. And along with that, there's I had another thought and now it's gone. But yeah, there's the scientific bit. I'm gonna have to come back to that because I had a second part to it and then it just flew off. So that's my brain. My brain would probably have a difficult time with me because obviously it's the way it is.
We get that. Okay, let's jump into some psychological models first, and we're going to start with the depersonalization model. And that was proposed in the 1970s by one professor of psychiatry, Russell Noyes, and clinical psychologist Roy Cletty, which suggested that the NDE is a form of depersonalization experienced under emotional conditions such as life threatening danger, potentially inescapable danger, and that the NDE can best be understood as a hallucination. Now, according to this model, people who face their impending death, they detach themselves from their surroundings and their own bodies, and they no longer feel emotions and experience time distortions, which would make sense because your brain's trying to piece things together. But this model suffers from a number of limitations to explain NDEs for subjects who do not experience a sensation of being out of their bodies. Unlike NDEs, experiences are dreamlike, unpleasant, and characterized by anxiety, panic, and emptiness. Also, during NDEs, subjects remain very lucid of their identities, and their sense of identity is not changed, unlike those experiencing depersonalization. Next, we have the expectancy model. Another psychological theory is called the expectancy model. It has been suggested that although these experiences could appear very real, they had actually been constructed in the mind either consciously or subconsciously in response to the stress of an encounter with death or perceived encounter with death, and did not correspond to a real event. In a way, they are similar to wish fulfillment because someone thought they were about to die. They experienced certain things in accordance with what they expected or wanted to occur. Imagine that a heavenly place was a way to soothe themselves, though the stress of knowing that they were close to death. So they thought, we'll think of heaven so that when they die, when they have this experience, that's their first thought because that's what they're used to. They've trained their brain to think that. And they use their own personal and cultural expectations to put themselves in a scenario that would essentially protect them against imminent threats to their lives, or sort of give them a peaceful transition to the next chapter of whatever comes after this. But their accounts often differ from their own religious and personal expectations that regard death. Now, this contradicts the hypothesis that they may have imagined this scenario based on cultural or personal backgrounds and or feelings, thoughts, and emotions. Now, the term NDE, which was coined in 1975, and the experience first described then, recent descriptions of these NDEs do not differ from those reported earlier than 1975. The only exception is a increase in the description of a tunnel. So the information about these things could be more easily attained after 1975, but did not influence people's reports of what they were doing. So that being said, these things happened, right? But they've been happening. This is something that's been happening long before any of us were born. 1800s, 1700s, BC era time, this thing was happening. Now, the one thing that I think we need to really sit back and understand is, hey, Zach's here. What's up, buddy? Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the show. What we need to understand here is that because of this, there are going to be similarities regarding that. The tunnel, for instance, there was more increases of the tunnel aspect. But like I said, it did not influence people's reports. But a secondary flaw of this model can be found in children's accounts of NDEs. Now, they are in fact similar to an adult's experience of an NDE, despite children being less affected, strength-wise, by religious and personal and cultural influences about death. So there is your expectancy model, expecting these things to happen. And this is something that I have thought about while when we talked about Annalise Michael, the exorcism of Annalise. I have gone on to say that I think that she was not in fact possessed at all, but rather her brain, she was a paranoid schizophrenic. Because they put her on the drugs to sort of calm her brain, which worked. They were working. She was getting better, but the priest and things took her off of them immediately, instantaneously. And the thing about medication is, most medications you really can't quit cold turkey. You got to wean yourself off of that, and so getting stripped away from that medication essentially broke her brain to a point that she could not come back from. And so she took what she saw every day, being religious iconography, wanting to be a nun and everything else. And that was the game that her brain wanted to play with her and put that out in the open. So, of course, being in a Catholic situation, her dementia-based breakdowns and her bipolar, her schizophrenic breakdowns were going to be religious-centered. They weren't going to be anything else. Now, the interesting point here is that model doesn't hold up with NDEs, because NDEs here, they all kind of fit the similar bill regarding these things. What do you gentlemen think? We'll start with Steve, the intern. Steve?
Okay, so actually mentioning that particular type of NDE, I actually think I have an experience that can counteract that one.
Okay.
So, in the Journal of Near-Death Experiences, psychiatrist Brian Weiss wrote about an elderly woman who had an NDE in the year 2000. And according to her, 1 second she was laying there, and the next she was floating above her body. She didn't know it at the time, but she was in cardiac arrest, and her heart had stopped beating. She watched it as the doctors rushed over to revive her, and noticed a pin fall out of the pocket of one of the doctors, and he bent down to pick it up. Minor detail, right? No big deal. Days later, after they had managed to resuscitate her, she told them about her experience, and the doctor said she had likely been hallucinating since her heart had stopped, and there was no oxygen being pumped to her heart. But when the woman described in great detail the doctor losing his own pin, he couldn't believe it. Not only because she was unconscious, she was also blind. A blind woman watched him drop his pin and pick it back up while her heart was stopped. So if it's just a hallucination, how would she have a hallucination of something that was actually happening when she's blind at that?
The only thing I would be able to come up with is because when a person loses one sense, their other sense is heightened to an extraordinary level. So she might have heard something fall on the floor.
Even still, though, her heart was stopped. So even still, that would still be impressive.
I'm not saying it's not possible,
Yeah.
but I like to look at all the other options that I have before I make a full judgment call on what it could or could not be, if that makes sense. Spider?
The thing about the brain is a pretty powerful part of the body. It's even if a person is blind or deaf or colorblind or they can't smell
Daredevil.
or something like that, the brain still has the capacity to be able to do those things. It's just
Mhm.
usually a disconnect between that and other things. So if you're having a traumatic experience, such as your body is basically dying, your brain is going to kind of kick into overdrive and be like, hey, we need to use every bit of what we have to keep this body going because your brain's
Yeah.
going to shift into survival mode. It's like part of the autonomous nervous system. You don't think about it, you don't know that it's working, but it's what's keeping everything moving and everything
Right.
working. It's most of the brain has nothing to do with you actually using it for coherent thought and everything to do with keeping you alive on a level that you don't even notice. And so it's not outside of the realm of possibility that if you're having an experience where again a traumatic experience like that where basically you're declared dead or dying so close to it that you're basically any second everything's going to shut down, your brain is going to shift into a different, almost a different form of consciousness. It's going to activate things that it might not usually need to on a daily basis to be like, hey, we got to get you moving. And so you'll be able to see, you'll be able to hear, you'll be able to smell, you'll be able to, all of these senses that you might not have had before because of certain deficiencies you had in your body. And I remembered the other point I was going to make too about that. We talked about astral projection and similar out of body experiences on a previous show, either last week or the week before. And this is a lot like that. Near death experiences are very similar to conscious out of body experiences like astral projection.
Yep.
Again, it's all centered on the brain. The brain is an incredibly powerful organ. And it's everything that you are is essentially in that. And we kind of think it's funny or grotesque or something when we see sci-fi things where somebody's brain's taken out and put in a jar and they talk through it and whatnot. But theoretically, that's all you would really need to be you, your brain in another part, because it contains the full sum of you. If you have a soul or if you have a life force, it's all going to be concentrated there and it's going to keep you alive at all costs. And that's it, it makes things interesting when you consider the number of people, because there's more than one story of people who've been blind or otherwise limited, and then when they have a near death experience,
Yeah.
they can see or they
Right.
can hear or different things that they could not do before, because that's the power of the brain exceeding the abilities of the body.
Like how we
Okay.
barely untap the potential of our brains.
Yes. Very much agreed. Okay, let's get into some physiological models. And I would first want to talk about the neuroanatomical model. And I want to let you guys know this is going to be kind of heavy in terms of like the information I'm going to give you.
Mhm.
So, we're going to get to the cases, but I wanted to get into this first. So, the first one being that the neuroanatomical model is basically hypothesized to originate from the different anatomical areas of the brain, namely the limbic system, the hippocampus, and the left temporal lobe. Now, the Reiser's fiber in the central canal of the spinal cord, the prefrontal cortex, and the right temporal lobe. So, all of these parts play a key role, in an NDE. Now, neuroscientists Olaf Blanc and Sebastian Duegues from the École Polytech Fédérale de Lausanne in Switzerland proposed a brain-based model with two types of NDEs. The first type of NDE, these are due to bilateral frontal and occipital, but predominantly right hemispheric brain damage that affects the right temporal partial junction and characterized by out-of-body experiences, altered sense of time, sensations of flying, lightness, vection, and flying. The type 2 NDEs are also due to the bilateral frontal and occipital, but predominantly left hemispheric brain damage affecting the left temporal partial junction, and characterized by feeling of a presence, meeting and communication with spirits, seeing of glowing bodies, as well as voices, sounds, and music without vection. They suggest that this damage to the bilateral occipital cortex may lead to visual features of NDEs in regards of seeing a tunnel, lights, and damage to unilateral or bilateral temporal lobe structures such as the hippocampus or the amygdala may lead to emotional experiences, memory flashbacks, or a life review. And they conclude that future neuroscientific studies are likely to reveal that the neuroanatomical basis of the NDE will lead to the demystification of the subject without needing paranormal explanations. And French, another gentleman who studied these, wrote that the temporal lobe is almost certain to be involved in NDEs, given that both damage to and direct cortical stimulation of this area are known to produce a number of experiences corresponding to those of the NDE, including but not limited to OBEs, hallucinations, and memory flashbacks. Now, Van Houdenhouse in 2009 reported that recent studies employing deep brain stimulation and neuroimaging have demonstrated that out-of-body experiences result from a deficient multisensory integration at the temporal partial junction, and that ongoing studies aim to further identify the functional neuroanatomy of near-death experience by means of standardized EEG recordings. Now, some criticisms of this model is that it's speculative due to lack of data. In addition, reports of those who've had brain stimulation were nothing like OBEs reported by those who had NDEs, and they're mainly characterized by a sense of elevation and often limited spatial awareness. While other characteristics of NDEs were absent, anomalies such as seeing maps, half bodies, and duplications were also noted. And now they also admit that although some of the neuroanatomical models proposed may serve to explain NDEs and pathways through which they are expressed, they remain speculative at this stage since they have not been tested in empirical studies. Now, the next one here is the neurochemical model. Wico Jones coming in with hot with his take. He says, but that wouldn't explain NDEs that happen when death is impending but causing no actual harm at the time. Like a
cancer
heart attack.
patients?
Like a heart attack. But I think that's because, once again, it could be a blood thing where your blood is having to be pumped in different directions. But that's a good point because it doesn't explain. Go ahead, Stephen the intern, yes.
Oh, yeah, I actually found a case about a heart attack where a man died for 45 minutes and then woke up again.
We're going to talk about that here in a second.
Yeah.
But I want to jump back in here to a quick point to talk about the neurochemical model. Now, some theories think that NDE's experiences are results from drugs used during resuscitation. In the case of resuscitation-induced NDEs, for example, ketamine, or from endogenous chemicals, neurotransmitters that transmit signals between brain cells. Now, I want to take a second here to say something. I, in my younger years, tried ketamine. And it is a very weird drug. It's a very much of a horse tranquilizer and does make one feel somewhat separated from their body. This is a very long time ago. So it's like, get in the comments and be like, I think you did it yesterday. I saw it.
Last week.
Did not. I did it like twice and I never did it again because it feels like you are not yourself. It's a very interesting feeling. You don't feel like you're in your own body. You feel like you're somebody else. So having done that, I can kind of relate to this. But in the early 80s, Daniel Carr writes that NDE has characteristics that are suggestive of a limbic lobe system. And the NDE can be explained by the release of endorphins and enkephalins in the brain. Endorphins are endogenous molecules released in times of stress and lead to a reduction in pain perception and a pleasant, even blissful emotional state. In 1983, Judson and Wiltshaw note that the administration of endorphin-blocking agents such as naloxone had been occasionally reported to produce hellish NDEs that would be coherent with endorphins role in causing a positive emotional tone of most NDEs. Morris in 1989 proposed a model arguing that serotonin played a more important role than endorphins in generating NDEs, at least with respect to mystical hallucinations and OBEs. Now, in 2009, a large scale study finds that ketamine, salvia divinorum, and DMT and other classical psychedelic substances are linked to near death experiences. But I have a theory on that, and which I'll go with here in a second. But according to some researchers, neurochemical models are not backed by data. This is true for NMDA receptor activation, serotonin and endorphin release models. And they write that no data has been collected via thorough and careful experimentation to back a possible causal relationship or even an association between neurochemical agents and NDE experiences. Wico says again, this wouldn't be a worldwide phenomenon if chemicals administered were the case. Same thing with endorphins. Certain health issues that cause death don't give the body time to register pain. And you're right. A sudden heart attack that knocks somebody out for a solid 8 to 10 minutes, it's a little bit different. It doesn't have that time. You're instantaneous. You get into a bad car accident, instantaneous sometimes. They got to bring you back to life. Gentlemen, what are our thoughts here on these two models? I do think it's interesting that it takes both into account, that it is a brain functionality issue, and the second model diving into drugs or driving into psychedelics, which I want to touch on this too. Yeah, how do you test that, Weekos? You're right. We just line up people like, all right, we're gonna give you this thing. You might die permanently. We could test these on certain people in the penile
Terminally
system.
ill patients,
We could,
maybe?
no, not even just certain types of folks
I
that
get
are
what
in
you're getting
jail
at.
for some heinous activities.
Yeah.
We could test it on them. They're not people anyway. So, and yeah, I've said it.
Oh,
I've
the
said it. We know what
the
I'm talking about.
death system. My brain is not working. I forgot. Executions in prison, they're legal. So just change the
So why
method.
can't medical experimentation? But that's a whole nother episode for a whole nother show. I think it's interesting, the idea that the Buddha monks could get to a point where they can have NDEs and they're not taking any drugs or having any sort of physical ailments. They're not having any heart attacks, brain damage, things like that. So it's almost like they're reaching a state of euphoric relaxation that we can all
Nirvana.
attain, but getting to that point or getting to attain that point is a well-guarded secret for some reason, because the person I talked to today about her NDE, she said that she got a sort of mediumship from it. And she got a piece of her grandma because her grandma was involved in that. So she said she's a medium now because of it, and she can talk to spirits and things of that nature. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. And I'm not going to doubt her. She's a good friend, good person. I know her and her husband very well. They're good people. So I can't, with 100% yes or no, say that's true or not. I can only go on the information that she's given me, but I have read other accounts where people seem to gain almost psychic powers, if you will, from having almost died, going over to that spirit realm, bringing back a piece. It's like they leave a piece of themselves in the spirit realm and they bring another piece of themselves back. Now, obviously, whatever you believe is whatever you believe. But I think that scientifically, that's an interesting point, that they're taking something from the next life and bringing it right back here. Gentlemen, thoughts? Start with Steven the intern. What you got for us?
So I think it's interesting that
Excuse
you
me.
mentioned about them bringing a piece of themselves back, because I've also heard that in a lot of the stories I've been listening to, and that a lot of the stories also say how they communicate telepathically. And like you said about, you can believe what you believe, but a lot of these stories mention like beings of light, and a
Yeah.
few have even mentioned like angels and demons. And I'm like,
Mhm.
I consider myself to be atheist, and I personally don't believe in that stuff, but even as someone who considers themselves to be atheist, you still have to look at this. There's like thousands and thousands of cases where the same people are mentioning the same things, regardless of what they believe, what they were raised to believe, or their culture, or where they are. So I
And
think
there's
that's pretty interesting.
and there's been plenty of cases where atheists ended up turning and believing in God because they see
Yeah.
that, oh, okay, there is something.
And another thing that I heard some people mention in some of the cases I was listening to earlier today was some people have said that it's less of a creator of everything. And okay, you were talking about Final Fantasy earlier. Mako, Final Fantasy VII. They believe that Mako is like the life force of the world, the universe, and that everything comes from the life stream, as they call it. And upon death, it all returns to the life stream. And I've heard a lot of these people in the NDEs telling their stories, and they describe it as, they do meet what they call God, but it's less of like your typical God that you hear of in your standard religion, and it's more like the universe itself, the original source of all creation, and they describe it as just this bright light. And some people have described it as like the classic Hallmark, old man with a beard and all that, and others have described it as looking like Jesus, and others have just described it as a bright light. But they all say that it's just the essence of creation, and they get that feeling when they're near this entity.
As we've kind of been mentioning, the brain is very, very powerful, and it'll
Yes.
latch on to a lot of different ideas and a lot of different
Yeah.
things. Um, I think part of it too is because we know that information can travel genetically through generations.
Yep.
I think that there was a point somewhere in the distant past, as part of modern humans, that's encoded in the DNA, where we had a universal belief in something that was greater than ourselves, whether it was actually something religious or whether it was an alien being or whether it was something else or even just a force of nature. We came to bring that information as part of who we are. And it's even in the modern day where you can be like, oh, well, I'm enlightened. I believe in this and I believe in this and I don't believe in that because that's fairy tales. Your brain will still keep that data from
True.
generations of people before you who believed that there was something else out there. And we know that because when trauma happens, that's a fracturing. That's a fracturing in the way that the brain perceives things, the way that the brain performs, and it's gonna bring up whatever it needs to bring up to be like, "You gotta get back up. You gotta lay up. You gotta start breathing again. You gotta do this. You gotta
Yep.
cooperate with the people trying to bring you back." And what's interesting about that is it's all centered around the brain and the autonomous nervous system, which we don't think about. It controls everything about us. It controls our breathing. It controls, like, you don't think about breathing. Now that I've said that, you're gonna think about breathing. But generally you don't because it's all automatic. And we think about things like yoga, like of just people doing stretches and doing whatever nowadays, but yoga as a concept was tied to the autonomous nervous system for for the most strict Eastern believers in the practice. It's a form of meditation that's very intense, and it's about using and altering the autonomous nervous system, which is basically attuning parts of the brain that you couldn't access otherwise. And there's a lot of cultures that do that, and it has a lot to do with our psyche. And I think most of where what we get from near death experiences pulls back from that ancient line of genetic information that we used to have as everyday. People, like in ancient past, used to every day, everything about their lives was spiritual. Every single piece of their lives was something spiritual, whether they got up in the morning to eat breakfast, work in the fields, do whatever. It was all tied to some form of spirituality before even the big monotheistic religions came about. Everything you did, And that became part of the DNA. And when you have a traumatic experience, your brain is going to reach back deep into that to a primal source and be like, hey, if this is going to help bring us back and keep us going for another day, we're going to grab it and we're going to do it. And there's so many schools of thought that are involved in accessing that. That's why you have, if you're going to do, like Robert mentioned, DMT and things like that,
Yeah.
there's Aborigines and there's native societies that they do the peace pipe kind of thing and the walkabout and the vision quest, and it's to use things like that to access that part of the brain because that's encased in the data in our genetic makeup. And it's super fascinating once you tie all that together, and I think that's a lot of what's prompting a lot of the near death experiences, why they have a spiritual experience when in the rest of their lives they might not have been spiritual at all, because you're drawing on a source of information that you normally wouldn't have had access to.
Like the human consciousness.
I've talked about
Universal
this
consciousness.
before.
Yeah.
I've talked about this before, sometimes ad nauseum, that the concept of, I don't believe in past lives. Never have, never will. It's not my thing. People that do, that's fine. I like to call it DNA imprint, where your relatives, your people, your past, your ancestors, your lives before, your BC, your AD, is all imprinted in your brain the minute you were born, the minute you are that cell in that body. Your DNA is made, it's created. But your DNA is the chemical makeup of every other person in your family that came before you. Let me give you an example. So sometimes people have a favorite food, right? And they're like, oh, your grandfather loved that food, but I don't. Was that passed down? Was that trait passed down? That's as simple as I can get it. It's interesting, almost like a genetic memory. But then when I think about primal source, what if it's an ancestral memory from the creation of man itself, which is almost like the fear of the dark. The fear of the dark is a very primal thing. We are taught that bad things happen in the dark, right? We're taught that people get kidnapped in the dark, people get killed in the dark, people get robbed in the dark, you get mugged down a dark alleyway. Dark, dark, dark. Broad daylight, broad daylight, for the most part, you're not going to get robbed. I mean, I'm sure if you go some places, you could. But I think there's primal fears, primal needs, and primal wants that we have, and primal lusts that we have that just exist because they've always existed, because we're mankind. They exist for a sole purpose, and we are the ones that have to understand that purpose. Now, let's jump over here to Steven. Steven, give us a couple cases before we call it a night.
Okay. One that stood out to me is it's gonna be a little bit older.
Okay. He's like
What?
25 BC.
Well, not far off. How about 380 BCE?
Okay, go ahead. I was
You
close.
you remember that stuff the kids play with? It smells kind of weird, like plasticky. Play-Doh.
Silly putty? Oh, Plato.
Play-Doh, yeah. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato. Well, he gets credit
I
for the
should kick
oldest.
you off. I should kick you off live show for that. No more of that, or you're
I
fired.
missed the
Boo.
dad jokes.
Boo.
Anyways, he gets credit for the oldest written account of an NDE. He wrote a book called Republic, which was published around 380 BCE,
Yep.
with a story called, and I had some trouble
That's a banger.
understanding the pronunciation,
a
the
hit.
myth of I think it was
Spell it.
well, it was AI generated subtitles. It
Oh,
said URR. So I think.
I think it's AEHR, I think.
All right.
Anyways, continue.
Okay, so he died in battle, and 10 days after his death, his body was found perfectly preserved, and 2 days later after that, his funeral pyre was set alight, and he woke up. When they managed to get him away from the fire, he told them his story and tried his best to tell them about what he claimed to be an indescribable paradise he had seen along with several other souls. He claimed that together they met a panel of judges who ultimately decided their fate. Virtuous souls were sent up into the sky, while treacherous lives got sent down below the earth. but the judges wanted to just observe so he could be sent back to his body to relay the experience to the rest of us so that we can understand that morality is rewarded and cruelty is punished in the afterlife. Many people even believe that the story of helped to shape modern religious thought for centuries after it was published, leading to the modern day conceptualization of hell and heaven as similar examples of the afterlife in several religious texts published at later dates after his book, including the New Testament, the Quran, and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And in the New Testament, it speaks of Judgment Day, in which God decided who will go to heaven or hell. The Quran speaks of the day of resurrection, when the righteous will enter paradise, which
Yep.
they call Jahannam, and the wicked will enter Jahannam, which is basically hell. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead states that when a person dies, they're sent back to earth in a new body, but you can remain in the hereafter if they have achieved nirvana, which is known as the ultimate state of peace and enlightenment.
Big shout out to Grace. Hey Grace, how you doing tonight? Welcome on in. Good to see you. Good to see you. That's the interesting aspect. A lot of these NDEs, it's this heavenly paradise, and it's really only two logical explanations. It's either the heavenly paradise or the hellish landscape. There's never a middle ground in NDEs that I was able to pull up in any form of contact. There was
What
no like,
about
yeah, it was I was in the middle of like Utah
It was
fishing,
okay.
in a stream. You know what I mean?
It was
Yeah,
fine.
I was going to
you're
say, what
very
about
welcome, Grace. Thank
purgatory?
you.
What
I
what
don't.
would that be?
Well, for the most part, I've never seen or read any accounts of people going to purgatory in an NDE.
Yeah,
In an
I just
NDE,
meant like in general.
you're either going to a heavenly landscape or you're going to a hellish landscape. There's no intermediaries. Like there's no purgatory. There's no like, yeah, I went to a waiting room and I
Yeah.
sat there. You know what I mean? And that's the interesting aspect of these NDEs, which, The Myth
I
of
always
by
thought
Plato's Republic. Interesting book. Very much so interesting
thank you,
book,
Wicos
yes.
Jones.
I
Thank
haven't
you.
read that in a long time. I haven't really read much of Plato's stuff. I was too busy playing with it. So, dude, yeah,
There
I
we
can do that
go.
too.
Meh, 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 meh.
Yep.
I
I missed
gotta
that
watch the old man hurt for a little bit. Give us another one. What else do you have there?
So earlier when you were talking about heart attacks, I
Yes, sir.
found one that said a man died for 45 minutes and he awoke after seeing the afterlife. So Brian Miller was declared dead after suffering a massive heart attack at Ohio Hospital. Then, to the surprise of nurses and doctors, after 45 minutes, his heart randomly started beating again. Miller, age 41, told WJW-TV that while he was out, he saw a light and relatives who had passed away. He remembers walking along a heavenly path lined with flowers. He was then stopped by his mother-in-law who had just passed away. She grabbed a hold of my arm and told me, "It's not your time." Miller said he met another relative before waking up. Despite that, for 45 minutes, his brain did not receive any oxygen, and they said Miller did not suffer any brain damage. There is an afterlife, and people need to believe in it, he said. And like Spider has been saying, it could just be our brains making this stuff up.
But 45 minutes, the brain
yeah.
clinically dies, I believe, after 8.
Actually, this was unrelated until just now, but I would like to mention something I learned recently that I thought was very interesting. There was once and my source is Time Life magazine. Time Life magazine wrote a story about a chicken that the farmer cut its head off, trying to cook it for dinner, and the chicken was able to survive another 18 months without its head. So how does that work?
As silly as that
obviously with
sounds,
humans are different. Our brains are bigger. They adapt to more things. They have more neural synapses that allow it to function in certain ways. This is something that I think we need to study more of because the human brain is very powerful. And while yes, I do believe in an afterlife, and I have my own beliefs on all of those things, I think as a whole, as a collective society, once again, we have, I don't want to say powers, but it's the best word that I can use um, as a point. We develop certain attributes, or maybe we've had certain attributes before before
We
we
need to
know.
wake up to them.
And so some people have them. And like I said, this is something that I find to be really fascinating to me. Everybody I talked to about an NDE changed. They didn't come back the same person. Not that they came back in a sort of crazy, like they were a complete 180 of themselves, mind you. They were, in fact, more attuned to the spiritual concepts that govern their lives currently. They weren't as in tune. They didn't fully understand the way the situations worked in the spiritual aspect, but they have these NDEs. And the interesting aspect I want to say too is that when it comes to heart attack patients, they seem to be the ones who have the most NDEs of everybody that I had noticed. It's like they have that ability because their heart sort of gives out and their brain sort of shuts down in a way because it has to put all its processing power into trying to save the person, as Spider said previous and prior, that they sort of they become a different person when they come out of the NDE. And I don't know if that's because it's death, right? Because death is death is everybody's best friend, whether you want to admit it or not. At the end of the day, we all have to take that ride by ourselves. We all got to go at some point. Like the saying goes, the only thing you can do when death smiles at you is smile back. Ain't nothing else you can do. The great equalizer of all man is death. So
Actually,
that being said, when you die, I think that there's something that's it's an energy transference. And I think you're in the process of energy transferring to the next level or next wherever you're going. And I think that when you interrupt that sort of transition or that process and come back, you gain some of what you were processing into when you come back.
Now, one final point to make too
Please do.
is that normally we have these NDEs, and they're within a relatively short time span. But we still get stories, true stories, like documented news stories to this day
Yeah.
of people who have been declared dead. Their body has been prepared. They're on their way almost to the funeral, and they wake up. It's not like a story or an urban legend. It's mainstream news
Yeah.
that people in 2024 wake up after having been declared dead. Now, is that just a fault of us thinking they're dead, like the medical examiner is just incompetent? Well, you got to wonder how many people have they gone through that have been dead that they've said, okay, well, they're definitive dead before this one person came along.
that's why
It's not like they don't have experience.
Right.
And there's also stories, and that leads into stories of the past of voodoo practices.
Yeah.
With the Bokor, who brings people back from the dead as a zombie, but not like Night of the Living Dead zombie, but as a thinking person.
Yeah.
A thinking alive person. And sometimes they continue to exist long after they're not associated with the person who brought them back. So it's an interesting, we don't have an explanation for a lot of this stuff. I mean, the brain is very powerful. And if it wants us to be alive strongly enough, we will be alive. It'll
Well, there it
jumpstart
is.
everything else.
There it is, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for another episode of This Uncanny Earth, your weekly paranormal podcast, where we get into all good things, esoteric, paranormal, and so much more. I want to thank my co-host Spider and our intern Steven for joining us tonight. Thank you, James. We appreciate you. Thank you, Wecos. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Alfie. Thank you, Zeus. Let's see if I'm forgetting anybody. Thank you, Baros. Thank you. I think that's it. I think I got everybody. Yes, I did. I got all of you. Much love. We appreciate it. We'll be back next week for some more of This Uncanny Earth. I think next week we're going to probably run into some we haven't really done a lot of I like to do some biomedical stuff at some point next week, some future biomedical aspects That's okay, Grace. Well, I appreciate you being here. And this episode will be available after the show goes off to watch
Always
in its
available on
full
demand.
on YouTube, on demand, on YouTube, on Facebook, everywhere you can find. And that's okay, Grace. I appreciate you. I'm glad you showed up. I do. I really appreciate you, James. I appreciate each and every one of you. I love each and every one of you. I thank you. If it wasn't for you guys, we wouldn't be here. So we are 100% grateful. We are blessed. I am thankful. We're thankful.
Like,
And it's
share,
yeah.
subscribe.
Please.
Always tell your friends. We want to move on
Please.
that road to monetization.
Yeah, we want to keep going, and I want to educate more people. I think more people should know about the stuff that goes on our planet in lieu of everything else that goes on. So like all the negative stuff that seems to go on every day, I want to put this out there as something that's positive that you can gain some knowledge and wisdom. And you can go to your friend and say, "Hey, I heard this podcast today and they were talking about NDEs. And did you know?" Great conversation pieces. So, yes, I love each and every one of you. You all have a wonderful day. And as always, why be boring when you can be uncanny? We will see you folks next week. Peace.